There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, wearing the drab camouflage of a Tuesday afternoon or the unassuming quiet of a hotel room thousands of miles from home. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They simply are. A shift in the air, a breath held a second too long, a weight against your shoulder that feels less like an accident and more like an anchor. And in that quiet, unassuming space, the entire architecture of your life, the scaffolding you so carefully erected, begins to groan under a pressure you never knew existed. You can ignore it, of course. Most of us do. We learn to live with the groaning, the strange settling of a foundation we thought was solid rock. But sometimes, the silence is too loud, the weight too deliberate, and you are forced to acknowledge that the person you thought you were and the future you had meticulously planned were just blueprints for a house you were never meant to live in. For me, that moment smelled of stale air conditioning and the cheap, floral-scented soap provided by the hotel chain, and it was defined by the simple, earth-shattering reality of my best friend, my engaged best friend, asleep on my shoulder. My own fiancée, Sarah, would have called it nothing. He was tired, Leo, she would have said, her voice a model of gentle reason, the same reason that had made her seem like such a perfect harbor for so long. You two worked too hard on these trips, and she would have been right on the surface. We were tired. Julian was running on fumes, a ghost haunting the edges of a high-stakes software rollout in a city that didn't care about his deadlines. But it wasn't the exhaustion that had pinned me to the stiff hotel armchair, afraid to move a single muscle. It was the way he had settled there. It hadn't been a sudden slump, the clumsy collapse of a body giving in to gravity. It had been a slow, deliberate lean, a conscious surrender. He had been talking, his voice a low murmur about server capacities and client expectations, his words fraying at the edges, and then he had gone quiet. I had felt the subtle shift of his weight, a questioning pressure against my arm, and when I didn't pull away, he had let his head finally come to rest in the curve of my neck and shoulder. It was a movement that felt less like falling asleep and more like coming home. And in the silent hum of the room, with the distant whine of traffic filtering through the double-paned glass, I felt the tectonic plates of my life shift. The future I had with Sarah, the one with the suburban house and the golden retriever we'd already named, suddenly felt like a photograph of someone else's life, a glossy print I was only holding for a friend. Julian and I met in college, a collision of two orbits that, by all rights, should have remained separate. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of confident energy that pulled people into his wake. He was studying computer science, but he moved through the world like an athlete, all easy grace and broad shoulders, his laughter a loud, infectious thing that could fill a lecture hall. I was not that. I was a photography student, a creature of quiet observation, more comfortable behind a lens than in the middle of a conversation. I saw the world in frames, in compositions of light and shadow, and people were often just elements within that frame, their stories something I tried to capture from a distance. We were introduced by a mutual friend at a party I had no business being at, a loud, sticky affair in a basement that smelled of spilled beer and youthful desperation. He was holding court, telling some grand, embellished story, and I was in a corner, cataloging the way the cheap party lights cast strange, fleeting colors on the faces around him. Our friend dragged me over, and Julian turned that megawatt smile on me, a smile that seemed to generate its own gravitational pull. He shook my hand, his grip firm and warm, and asked what I was studying. When I mumbled photography, he didn't give the usual dismissive nod. Instead, his eyes lit up. "So you see things," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "You notice the stuff the rest of us miss." That was the beginning. He seemed to find my quietness not awkward, but interesting, a puzzle to be solved. He would seek me out in the crowded dining hall, plopping his tray down opposite mine, and launching into a monologue about a frustrating professor or a breakthrough in his coding, while I would just listen, occasionally offering a quiet comment that seemed to delight him more than any witty retort could. He became my greatest subject. My portfolio from that year was, essentially, a study of Julian. Julian, laughing with his friends on the campus green, his head thrown back in genuine joy. Julian, hunched over a laptop in the library, the glow of the screen illuminating the intense concentration on his face, a stray lock of dark hair falling over his forehead. Julian, exhausted after a late-night study session, his usual energy banked to a low, warm ember. I learned the cartography of his face, the way a small muscle near his eye would twitch when he was stressed, the way the corner of his mouth would turn up just before he was about to make a joke. I was documenting him, telling his story through my lens, but what I was really doing was falling in love with him, a slow, quiet, and utterly hopeless process, like watching a photograph develop in a darkroom, the image emerging gradually, inevitably, until it was the only thing you could see. He never knew, of course. I built walls around that feeling, thick and soundproof. Our friendship was too important, a rare and precious thing that I couldn't risk shattering with the clumsy weight of my own heart. He was a planet, and I was a grateful moon, content to orbit, to reflect his light. He dated, of course, a string of bright, bubbly women who seemed to match his energy, who could keep up with his quick wit and social stamina. I was the friend he brought them to meet, the quiet, steady presence who would offer a gentle, non-threatening approval. I became an expert in the particular ache of watching him fall for someone else, of listening to him describe the thrill of a first kiss or the comfort of a shared silence with a woman who was not me. Each time, I would retreat further into my role as the observer, the chronicler, the safe harbor. It was a role I had perfected by the time he met Chloe. Chloe was perfect for him, or so everyone said. She was a consultant, sharp and ambitious, with a smile that was nearly as bright as his own. She understood his world of deadlines and deliverables, and she didn't just tolerate his ambition, she mirrored it. They were a power couple in the making, their futures plotted out on a shared calendar, a series of logical, well-planned steps toward a life of success and mutual admiration. When he told me he was going to propose, we were sitting in our favorite dive bar, the one with the sticky floors and the jukebox that only played songs from before we were born. He was practically vibrating with a nervous energy that was both endearing and excruciating to witness. He laid out the plan, the ring, the location, with the same precision he would use to plan a project launch. I listened, nodded, and told him she was a lucky woman and that he was a lucky man. I even helped him pick out the ring, offering opinions on clarity and cut, my voice steady while my insides felt like they were being scraped out with a dull spoon. When he announced their engagement, I was the first person he called after his parents. I toasted their happiness at their engagement party, my camera a welcome shield, allowing me to be present but separate, capturing their joy from a safe, professional distance. A year later, I met Sarah. She was a landscape architect, and our first meeting was a debate over the merits of Japanese maples versus dogwood trees for a public park project I was photographing. She was kind and intelligent, with a quiet strength that I found deeply calming. Being with her felt like finding shade on a relentlessly sunny day. It was peaceful. It was logical. She was beautiful and funny, and she loved me. Or at least, she loved the version of me I presented to the world, the steady, dependable artist, the good friend, the reliable partner. Our relationship progressed along a sensible, well-paved road. We moved in together. We adopted a cat. We met each other's families. And when, one evening, over a bottle of wine and a home-cooked meal, she brought up the idea of marriage, it felt like the next logical step on that road. Saying yes to her felt like the right thing to do, the adult thing to do. It felt like closing a door on the chaotic, impossible longing I still harbored for Julian and stepping into a calm, well-lit room where a life could be built. I convinced myself that this quiet contentment was happiness, that the wild, aching feeling Julian inspired was just a youthful infatuation that I needed to finally outgrow. So I proposed to Sarah, with a ring I chose myself, and we began to plan our own logical, well-ordered future, right alongside Julian and Chloe. We were two best friends, two happily engaged men, on parallel tracks to the same respectable destination. The business trip was a sudden necessity, a 5-day emergency deployment to Seattle to salvage a project for the tech firm where we both now worked. Julian, as the lead engineer, and me, as the lead on user experience and interface design, a field my photography background had surprisingly prepared me for. Our fiancés were disappointed but understanding. "Just another work thing," Chloe had said, kissing Julian goodbye with the efficient affection of a long-term partner. Sarah had packed me a bag of my favorite snacks and made me promise to call every night. It was routine. It was normal. The company, in a fit of budget consciousness, had booked us a single hotel room with 2 queen beds. We'd shared rooms dozens of times before on trips like this. It was unremarkable, another detail in the drab camouflage of corporate travel. But this time felt different, though I couldn't have articulated why. There was a new tension in Julian, a wire pulled too taut beneath the surface of his usual confidence. The project was a nightmare, the clients were demanding, and the pressure of his impending wedding seemed to be compounding the stress, creating a perfect storm of anxiety that was slowly eroding his defenses. The first night, he barely spoke. He came back to the room long after I did, shedding his jacket and tie like a suit of armor he was too weary to carry. He collapsed onto his bed and just stared at the ceiling, his jaw tight. I asked him if he was okay, and he just shook his head, a gesture of profound exhaustion. I didn't press. I just sat in the armchair by the window, editing photos on my laptop, creating a bubble of quiet industry that I hoped would be a comfort. After a long while, he spoke, his voice raspy. "Can we just put a movie on? Something stupid. I can't think anymore, so I did. I found some mindless action movie on the hotel's pay-per-view, and we watched it in near silence, the flickering light of the screen painting our faces in shifting hues of blue and orange. He didn't fall asleep on his own bed. He migrated, slowly, to the foot of mine, leaning against the post, his eyes fixed on the screen but clearly not seeing it. He was just there, seeking proximity. I didn't say anything. I just let him be, my heart a frantic, muffled drum against my ribs. The next day was worse. A series of disastrous meetings left Julian looking pale and hollowed out. That evening, back in the room, the ritual repeated itself, but with a subtle escalation. He didn't even pretend to go to his own bed. He sat on the edge of mine while I worked, and when I suggested a movie, he just nodded. This time, he didn't stay at the foot of the bed. He stretched out, lying on his stomach, his head propped on his hands, his feet just inches from my hip. The sheer size of him, his presence in my space, was overwhelming. I tried to focus on my laptop, on the lines of code and the design mock-ups, but my entire awareness was consumed by the man lying beside me. I was conscious of the rise and fall of his back with each breath, the sound of the fabric of his shirt stretching, the warmth radiating from his body. It was an intimacy that felt both deeply comforting and wildly inappropriate. We were 2 engaged men. We were best friends. This was nothing. It was just 2 guys, exhausted, sharing a room. I repeated this mantra in my head, a desperate incantation against the truth that was blooming in the quiet of that room. On the 3rd night, the pretense shattered completely. We came back from a soul-crushing dinner with the client, a meal filled with forced smiles and veiled threats about deadlines. Julian was a ghost. He walked into the room, dropped his keys on the dresser, and just stood in the middle of the floor, looking lost. I had already ordered room service, knowing he wouldn't have the energy to decide on food. I gestured to the armchair where I usually sat. "Sit down," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Eat something." He didn't move toward the armchair. He walked over to the small sofa pressed against the wall, a piece of furniture we had thus far ignored, and sat down heavily. He picked at his food, pushing a piece of chicken around his plate with a fork. I sat in the armchair opposite him, and the space between us felt charged, humming with everything that was going unsaid. His project was failing. His wedding was in 3 months. His carefully constructed life was beginning to splinter at the seams, and I was the only one here to witness it. He finally put his fork down and scrubbed a hand over his face. "I'm so tired, Leo," he whispered, the words raw and exposed. "I feel like I'm running a marathon that never ends." "I know," I said. It was all I could offer. He looked at me then, his eyes dark with a weariness that went beyond lack of sleep. It was a deep, spiritual exhaustion. "Chloe called earlier," he said, his voice flat. "She was asking about floral arrangements. Peonies or hydrangeas. And all I could think was, I don't care. I don't care about the flowers. I should care, right? I'm supposed to care," he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I feel like I'm playing a part in a play, and I've forgotten all my lines." My heart ached for him. I saw the panic flickering behind his eyes, the terror of a man who has followed a map his whole life only to realize he's been holding it upside down. I wanted to tell him that it was okay, that he was allowed to not care about flowers, that he was allowed to be lost. But I was engaged, too. I was on my own well-paved road. What right did I have to tell him it was okay to get lost in the woods? So I said nothing, and my silence became a space for him to fill. He stood up from the sofa and came over to the armchair I was in. He didn't sit in the empty one. He sank to the floor, leaning his back against the side of my chair, his head resting near my knee. We stayed like that for a long time, the only sounds the hum of the city and the frantic beating of my own heart. This was the night that led to the moment where I found myself pinned by the weight of his head on my shoulder. After sitting on the floor for what felt like an hour, he had finally stirred, pushing himself to his feet with a groan. I thought he was going to his bed, but he just stood there, looking at me. "I can't sleep," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My brain won't shut off. Can we just talk? For a bit?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He didn't go back to the sofa. He sat down in the armchair next to mine, the one I had left empty, and he started to talk. He talked about the pressure from his boss, the impossible expectations of the client, the dizzying spiral of wedding planning, the feeling that he was disappointing everyone, especially Chloe, especially himself. I just listened, letting his words wash over me, offering a quiet murmur of agreement or a nod of understanding now and then. And then, as his words began to slur with fatigue, he had leaned. That slow, questioning, deliberate lean. And I had let him. I had let him cross a line that had always been implicitly, sacredly drawn between us. His breathing evened out, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. His hair, soft and dark, tickled my cheek. I could smell the faint scent of his shampoo, a clean, sandalwood fragrance that was so uniquely him. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. This was so much more than a friend falling asleep on another friend. This was a confession. It was a plea. He had sought out not just my company, but my physical presence, my solidity, as a shield against the chaos in his own head. He had chosen me as his anchor in the storm. And as I sat there, a prisoner of my own desperate affection, I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that I would let him sleep there all night. I would sit in that uncomfortable chair until my muscles screamed in protest rather than risk disturbing him. I would let my own well-paved future with Sarah crumble into dust if it meant I could give him this small, quiet harbor. The photograph of my future was dissolving in the developing tray, and a new, terrifying, beautiful image was beginning to emerge in its place. An image of me and of him, in the quiet of a hotel room, finding a fragile, unspoken peace in the simple, profound act of leaning on each other. This new ritual, born from that night of desperate exhaustion, became the unspoken law of our remaining time in Seattle. The geography of the hotel room reconfigured itself around this silent need. The two queen beds became largely ornamental, his a place to toss his jacket, mine a surface for my laptop and camera gear. The real living space, the heart of the room, was the small cluster of 2 armchairs and a little table by the window. Each evening, we would return from the battlefield of the office, and the dance would begin. We would order food, or I would have already ordered it, and we would eat in a comfortable, weary silence. Then, as if pulled by an invisible tide, we would settle into the armchairs. I would open my laptop, pretending to work, and he would sit beside me, sometimes with his own laptop, more often just staring out the window at the rain-slicked streets below. He would talk, unburdening himself of the day's frustrations, his voice a low counterpoint to the click of my keyboard. I became his confessor, his sounding board, the one fixed point in his spinning world. The physical proximity, once a shocking transgression, became our new normal. He no longer waited until the point of collapse to lean on me. The touch would start earlier, more casually. His knee would press against mine. He would stretch, and his arm would drape over the back of my chair, his fingers sometimes brushing against my hair. Each touch was a small spark on my skin, a jolt to my system that I had to consciously, deliberately ignore. I had to treat it as nothing, as the thoughtless contact of two friends sharing a small space. But I knew it was not nothing. It was a language we were inventing on the fly, a vocabulary of touch that said all the things our mouths could not. It said, I am lost. It said, stay with me. And my stillness, my acceptance of his weight, my refusal to pull away, said, I am here. I will not leave you. I cataloged every single one of these moments, filing them away in the archives of my memory with the precision of a librarian. The time he fell asleep with his hand resting on my forearm, his fingers lax, the warmth of his skin seeping into mine. The way his breathing would sync with mine when he was finally, deeply asleep, our chests rising and falling in a silent, shared rhythm. I studied the relaxed lines of his face in repose, a stark contrast to the tight mask of stress he wore during the day. In sleep, he looked younger, the confident engineer and responsible fiancé stripped away to reveal someone vulnerable, someone unguarded. I wanted to protect that person with a ferocity that startled me. It was a feeling that went far beyond friendship. It was primal, possessive, and utterly terrifying. My entire relationship with Sarah, a bond built on sensible affection and shared goals, felt like a pale watercolor next to the vibrant, chaotic oil painting of my feelings for Julian. The night before we were due to fly home, the project finally broke. A late-night coding session, fueled by lukewarm coffee and sheer desperation, resulted in a breakthrough. The client was happy, the deadline was met, and the storm had passed. We walked back to the hotel from the office in the pre-dawn mist, the city quiet around us. The relief was palpable, but it was not jubilant. It was a hollowed-out, exhausted relief. The adrenaline that had sustained Julian for days had vanished, leaving a profound weariness in its place. When we got back to the room, he didn't even take off his shoes. He collapsed onto the sofa, the same one he had sat on that first night of his confession, and stared into space. The source of his immediate stress was gone, but the larger anxieties, the ones about flowers and weddings and forgotten lines, remained, now thrown into sharper relief by the sudden quiet. I sat in my usual armchair, watching him. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The trip was over. Tomorrow, we would fly home. We would return to our fiancés, to our separate lives, to the parallel tracks we were supposed to be on. This strange, intimate bubble we had created in room 1204 was about to burst. The thought of it was a physical pain, a sharp, cold dread in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't bear the idea of going back to the way things were, to the carefully maintained distance, to the role of the quiet, observant friend. I had tasted something else here, a different kind of connection, and the thought of giving it up felt like starving after a feast. Leo, he said, his voice so quiet I barely heard him. He was still staring at the wall, not looking at me. Yeah. I managed, my own voice rough. He took a deep breath. Thank you, he said. For this week. I would have fallen apart without you. You would have been fine. I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. You're the strongest person I know. He finally turned his head and looked at me, and his expression was one of such raw, unguarded vulnerability that it stole the air from my lungs. No, I'm not, he said simply. You are. You're like bedrock. I just feel steady when you're around. He stood up then, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought he was going to his bed, that the spell was broken, that the night would end with this polite, heartfelt thank you. But he didn't. He walked the few feet that separated us and stood in front of me. He looked down at me, his gaze searching my face as if looking for an answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. This was it. A precipice. We had been walking toward it all week, and now we were standing at the very edge. Would it be okay, he began, his voice a strained whisper, each word seeming to cost him a monumental effort. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The world stopped. The hum of the air conditioner, the distant traffic, the frantic beating of my own heart. It all went silent. There was only his question, hanging in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. It was a question that held the power to detonate both of our lives. A simple yes or no could change everything, forever. All my years of careful self-preservation, of building walls and maintaining a safe distance, screamed at me to say no, to laugh it off as an effect of exhaustion, to protect the friendship, to protect him, to protect myself, to protect Sarah and Chloe. But the man standing in front of me, the man I had loved in silence for a decade, was looking at me with an expression of such desperate, hopeful terror that all the logic and reason in the world evaporated. He wasn't the confident, conquering hero of our college days. He was just Julian, lost and tired and looking for bedrock. And in that moment, I knew I would rather face the fallout of any explosion than turn him away. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. He knelt in front of my chair, his knees hitting the cheap hotel carpet with a soft thud. He brought his hands up to cup my face, his palms rough against my stubble, his touch so achingly gentle it felt like a prayer. He searched my eyes for another second, a final moment of confirmation, and then he leaned in. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was hesitant, searching, a question asked in a language beyond words. It was soft and slow, a discovery. It tasted of stale coffee and exhaustion and a decade of unspoken longing. It was the quietest, most earth-shattering thing that had ever happened to me. It was the sound of two carefully constructed worlds collapsing into one another. And in the wreckage, something new and terrifying and beautiful was being born. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, our carefully separated universes now inextricably, terrifyingly merged. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. There was only the before, and now, the after. The flight home was a masterclass in shared silence. We sat side by side, a buffer seat between us that felt as wide as the Grand Canyon and as thin as a sheet of paper. We didn't speak of the kiss. We didn't speak of the week. We spoke of turbulence and landing times and the logistics of getting our bags. It was a frantic, clumsy attempt to rebuild the old structures around the new, gaping hole in our reality. But the architecture of our friendship was permanently altered. Every glance held a new weight. Every accidental brush of our hands was a jolt of electricity. The air between us was thick with the unspoken, with the ghost of that kiss in the quiet hotel room. I watched him from the corner of my eye as he stared out the window, his reflection a pale, distant version of the man who had knelt before me just hours earlier. He looked terrified, and if I were being honest with myself, so was I. The airport pickup was a surreal diorama of the lives we were supposed to be living. Sarah was there, her smile warm and welcoming, her hug a familiar comfort that now felt strangely foreign. A few feet away, Chloe was wrapping her arms around Julian's neck, her bright, confident energy a stark contrast to the haunted look in his eyes. He hugged her back, but I saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hands rested uncertainly on her waist. We were actors who had forgotten our lines, just as he'd feared, thrust back onto the stage after a shocking, unscripted moment in the wings. We exchanged pleasantries, the four of us, a bizarre double date of strangers. We talked about the trip in sterile, professional terms. It was intense, Julian said, his voice carefully neutral. But we got it done. Sarah squeezed my hand, her touch a tether to a reality that was slipping through my fingers. I'm just glad you're home, she said, and the simple, honest affection in her voice was a knife in my gut. The days that followed were a slow, creeping agony. Julian withdrew. He became a ghost. My texts to him, once answered within minutes, now lingered for hours or days before a short, non-committal reply would appear. Hey, busy day, swamped, talk later. All good, the easy, constant current of communication that had flowed between us for years had been dammed up. The silence was deafening. I felt like I was losing my mind, replaying every moment from Seattle, searching for clues, for evidence. Had I imagined the tenderness? The desperation? Was the kiss just a fluke, an aberration brought on by stress and exhaustion that he now deeply regretted? The thought was a cold, sickening dread that lived in my stomach. I had allowed myself, for one brief, shining moment, to hope. And now, I was being punished for it. My life with Sarah became a pantomime of normalcy. I went through the motions. I talked about our wedding venue. I offered opinions on invitation fonts. I smiled and kissed her and told her I loved her, and every word felt like a lie. She was not a fool. She sensed the distance, the new shadow in me. She attributed it to work stress, to the exhaustion from the trip. She became even more attentive, more loving, trying to soothe a wound she couldn't see. Her kindness was its own form of torture. It amplified my guilt, my sense of betrayal. I was a fraud, living in her house, sharing her bed, all while my heart and my head were stuck in a hotel room in Seattle, obsessing over a man who would no longer speak to me. After a week of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I drove to his apartment, the one he shared with Chloe, on a Saturday afternoon, my hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I knew Chloe was out for the day at a bridal shower. I had to know. I had to hear it from him, whatever it was. I needed the ambiguity to end, even if the truth destroyed me. He opened the door, and his face was a mask of surprise that quickly hardened into something guarded, wary. He looked tired, older than he had a week ago. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. He didn't invite me in. He stood in the doorway, a human barrier to his own life. "We need to talk," I said, my voice shaking slightly. I hated the weakness in it, but I couldn't control it. He glanced back over his shoulder into the apartment, as if afraid Chloe might materialize out of thin air. "It's not a good time. I don't care, Julian," I said, a surge of frustration cutting through the fear. "You can't just do that. You can't kiss me and then disappear. You don't get to do that." The accusation hung in the air, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, shame, maybe, or pain. He finally sighed, a sound of complete defeat, and stepped back, letting me into the apartment. It was immaculate, decorated in cool, neutral tones, a perfect reflection of Chloe's organized, tasteful world. It felt like a showroom, not a home. He didn't offer me a seat. We just stood in his perfect living room, two soldiers facing off on a pristine, beige battlefield. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice low, his arms crossed over his chest in a defensive posture. "The truth," I said, my heart pounding. "Just tell me the truth. Was it a mistake? Do you regret it? Just tell me, so I can move on." The words nearly choked me. He paced the room, running a hand through his hair, the picture of a man trapped in a cage of his own making. "A mistake? I don't know what it was, Leo. I was a mess. I wasn't thinking straight. Everything was falling apart, and you were just there. You were solid, so I was a port in a storm." I asked, the bitterness rising in my throat. "A convenient shoulder to cry on? And to kiss?" "No," he said, turning to face me, his eyes flashing with the spark of the old Julian. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't calculated. It just happened." He deflated again, sinking onto the arm of his perfect sofa. "I'm getting married in 2 months, Leo. To Chloe. I love her." He said the words, but they sounded hollow, like a line he was reciting from memory. He looked up at me, and his face was a portrait of misery. "What am I supposed to do? I've built this life. We have plans. Our families, everything is set. I can't just throw a bomb into all of it." And there it was. The fear, the crushing weight of expectation, of the life he was supposed to want. He wasn't denying what happened. He wasn't even denying the feeling behind it. He was just terrified of the consequences, of the wreckage it would create. My anger dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching sadness for both of us. He was drowning, and instead of reaching for the life raft I was offering, he was clinging to the anchor that was pulling him under, because it was familiar. "So you're choosing to be a ghost," I said softly. "You're going to walk through this perfect life you've built, and be miserable, because it's easier than being honest. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. You don't understand. I understand better than anyone, I said, my voice cracking. I've been a ghost for 10 years, Julian. I've been in love with you since we were kids, and I have stood by and watched you build a life with other people because I was too afraid to blow everything up. I know exactly what it's like. But in Seattle, I thought, for a minute, that you saw me. That you finally, actually saw me. Tears were welling in my eyes, hot and shameful, and I couldn't stop them. But I was wrong. You were just looking for a mirror. I turned and walked out, leaving him sitting in his perfect, silent living room. I didn't know if I had made things better or worse. I had laid my own heart bare, a final, desperate gamble. Now, the ball was in his court. He could continue to live in his beautiful, empty house, or he could find the courage to walk out the door and face the mess. As I drove away, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't marry Sarah. I couldn't stand next to her and promise her a future when my entire being was still tied to the man I'd just left behind. My own bomb had to be detonated, regardless of what he chose to do. My life of quiet observation was over. Telling Sarah was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. There is no gentle way to dismantle a person's future, no soft words to cushion the blow of a heart breaking. We sat on the sofa in the living room we had built together, the evening sun casting long shadows across the floor, and I told her the truth. Not the whole truth, not the part about Julian. That felt like a cruelty she didn't deserve, but the essential truth. I told her that I was not the man she thought I was, that the quiet contentment I felt with her was not the same as the deep, soul-level love a person deserves in a marriage. I told her that I was broken in a way she could not fix, and that marrying her would be the most profoundly selfish and dishonest act of my life. She was quiet for a long time, her hands clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. She did not cry, not at first. She was a landscape architect. She understood foundations, and she knew when one was irrevocably cracked. She just absorbed the information with a stillness that was more devastating than any rage could have been. "Is there someone else?" she finally asked, her voice quiet and steady, though I could see the tremor in her hands. The question hung in the air. I could have lied. It would have been easier, a cleaner break. But I owed her more than that. I owed her the dignity of a truth, however partial. "Yes," I whispered, "but it is complicated. It is not something that has a future." I was trying to protect her, to let her believe it was a hopeless, one-sided affair, but the words felt flimsy and false even as I said them. She nodded slowly, a single tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. "I knew," she said, her voice thick with unshed grief. "I knew something was wrong when you came back from Seattle. You were here, but you were gone." She looked at me then, her eyes clear and full of a pain that I had put there. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Leo. I really do." And in that moment of her own heartbreak, she offered me grace. It was a gift I in no way deserved, and it broke me. I moved out the next day, packing my life into cardboard boxes, each object a relic from a future that would now never exist. The quiet, well-lit room I had chosen for myself was gone, and I was back out in the chaotic wilderness, utterly alone. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of living in a sterile temporary apartment, of silence from Julian, of navigating the sad logistics of unraveling a shared life with Sarah. I was numb, adrift. I had blown up my own life on the faint, fading hope that Julian would do the same, and I had heard nothing. The silence felt like a definitive answer. He had made his choice. He had chosen the perfect, empty house. I began the slow, painful process of trying to accept it, of trying to figure out how to live in a world that no longer had him at its center, not even as a friend. The ache was a constant, physical presence, a dull weight in my chest. Then, late one Thursday night, my phone rang. I saw his name on the screen, and my heart seized. I stared at it for 3 full rings, my hand shaking, before I finally answered. "Hello," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Leo, it was him. His voice was thick, ragged. Can I come over?" I gave him the address to my temporary apartment, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror, and a tiny, dangerous spark of hope. 20 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find him standing in the hallway, looking like a shipwreck. He was pale, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he was holding a single, beat-up cardboard box. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, stripped of all his usual confidence, all his easy charm. He was just a man holding the wreckage of his life in a box. "It's over," he said, his voice cracking. "Chloe and I." "It's over." He stepped inside, and it was as if the strings holding him up were cut. The box fell from his hands, spilling a few books and a framed photo onto the floor. He didn't seem to notice. He just looked at me, his face crumpling, and he began to sob. Not quiet, controlled tears, but deep, gut-wrenching sobs of a man who had lost everything. And without a thought, I closed the distance between us and wrapped my arms around him. He collapsed against me, burying his face in my shoulder, his body shaking with the force of his grief. I held him, my own tears starting to fall, my hand stroking the back of his head. I held him as he mourned the life he had lost, the woman he had hurt, the man he had tried so hard to be. I was no longer an observer, no longer watching from behind a lens. I was his bedrock. I was his harbor. And in the ruins of our former lives, surrounded by the sad debris of our choices, we were finally, terrifyingly, home. The first few weeks were a delicate, fragile truce with the world. We lived in the quiet space of my temporary apartment, a neutral territory that belonged to neither of our pasts. The space was sparse, furnished with only the essentials, and that felt right. We were starting from a place of zero, with nothing but the raw, exposed truth of what we had done and who we were. There were no grand romantic gestures, no soaring declarations. There was mostly silence, but it was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the strained, anxious quiet of the flight home or the aching, empty quiet of the weeks of our separation. This was a healing silence, a space where we could simply be, without pretense. He slept on the sofa, a gesture of respect and caution that I understood and appreciated. He needed to grieve the end of his relationship with Chloe, and I needed to process the end of mine with Sarah. We were two people recovering from self-inflicted wounds, and we knew, instinctively, that healing had to come before building. Our days were simple. I would make coffee in the morning, and we would drink it sitting at the small kitchen table, often without speaking, just watching the city wake up outside the window. I would go to work, and he would spend the days making the painful calls, untangling the complex web of a canceled wedding, dividing assets, explaining the inexplicable to family and friends. When I came home in the evenings, I would often find him asleep on the sofa, utterly drained, a textbook on software architecture fallen open on his chest. I would cover him with a blanket and work quietly on my laptop, just as I had in Seattle, but this time, there was no anxiety, no frantic internal monologue analyzing his every breath. There was just a quiet, profound sense of rightness. This was where he was supposed to be. This was where I was supposed to be. We talked, eventually. Not about us, not at first, but about them. He told me about his final conversation with Chloe, the pain and confusion in her eyes as he tried to explain a truth he was only just beginning to understand himself. He spoke of her not with bitterness, but with a deep, sorrowful respect. She deserved better than a ghost, he said one night, his voice low. She deserved someone who could actually see her, who wasn't just looking through her at someone else. I told him about Sarah, about the quiet dignity with which she had accepted the end of our life together, about the grace she had shown me. We were honoring the pain we had caused, acknowledging the good women we had hurt in the process of finding our own difficult truth. It was a necessary part of the healing, a way of cleaning the wound before it could close. The shift, when it came, was as quiet and deliberate as his lean in the hotel room. It was a Tuesday night, about a month after he had shown up at my door. A thunderstorm was raging outside, the rain lashing against the windows. We had ordered pizza and were watching an old movie, me in the armchair, him stretched out on the sofa. The sound of a particularly loud clap of thunder made him jolt, a reflexive, unconscious movement. He looked over at me, his eyes wide in the flickering light of the television. "I hate thunder," he admitted, his voice small, almost childish. It was a vulnerability I had never seen, another layer peeled back. "Come here," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I had even thought them. It wasn't a command or a proposition. It was an invitation to safety. He hesitated for only a second before he got up from the sofa and came to me. He didn't sit in my lap or try to kiss me. He simply sank to the floor, just as he had in Seattle, and leaned his back against my legs, his head resting on my knee. I rested my hand on his shoulder, my fingers gently tracing the line of his collarbone. And we just sat like that, watching the movie, listening to the storm rage outside our small, safe bubble. His presence was a comfort, a weight that was no longer uncertain or fraught with unspoken meaning, but solid, real, and grounding. Later, when the movie was over and the storm had quieted to a distant rumble, he didn't move. He had fallen asleep, his breathing deep and even. I didn't want to wake him, to send him back to the lonely sofa. So I carefully shifted, easing him up so that I could stand, and then I guided him, half asleep and pliant, to my bedroom. I pulled back the covers of my bed, and he crawled in without a word. I walked around to the other side and slid in beside him. I turned off the light, and we lay there in the dark, side by side, not touching, just breathing in the quiet of the room. "Leo," he whispered into the darkness after a few minutes. "I'm here," I said. I felt him shift, turning onto his side to face me. I couldn't see his expression, but I could feel his presence, his warmth. "I think," he said, his voice slow and careful, "that I've been in love with you for a very long time. I was just too scared to see it, my heart, which I thought had already been through every possible permutation of feeling for this man, seemed to expand in my chest." "I know," I said softly. "I see you, Julian. I always have." He reached out then, his hand finding mine in the darkness, his fingers lacing through mine. His grip was firm, certain. There were no more questions, no more hesitations. This was not a moment of desperation in a hotel room. This was a conscious choice, a quiet beginning. He held my hand, and in that simple, profound connection, I felt the last of the groaning, unstable architecture of my old life finally settle into a new, solid foundation. A foundation built not on logic or expectation, but on a decade of quiet observation, on a shared history, on the terrifying, beautiful truth of being seen for exactly who you are. We began to build a new life from the rubble, not with blueprints and grand plans, but with small, daily acts of care and attention. We found a new apartment together, a space that was ours from the beginning, with tall windows that let in the morning light. We filled it not with perfect, showroom furniture, but with mismatched pieces we found in secondhand shops, each one with a story. He brought his collection of worn-out sci-fi paperbacks, and I brought my boxes of photographic prints. Our two separate histories began to merge, to create a new, shared narrative. The quiet domesticity that had once seemed like a life I would only ever get to observe from a distance was now my reality. Waking up next to him each morning, the simple, miraculous fact of his presence beside me, was a quiet joy that never faded. Making him coffee, watching him read the news on his tablet, the comfortable silence of two people who know each other so well that words are often unnecessary. These became the sacred rituals of our new life. My photography changed. For years, I had been an observer of other people's lives, a capturer of fleeting moments from the outside. Now, I began to turn the camera inward on our life. The photos were not for a portfolio or a client. They were for us. Julian, asleep in a patch of sunlight on the sofa, his face relaxed and peaceful. His hands, covered in flour, as he tried to teach himself how to bake bread. The two of us, our reflection captured in a shop window as we walked down the street, his arms slung comfortably around my shoulders. I was no longer just documenting a subject. I was participating in the story. I was finally in the frame. He, in turn, began to see the world through my eyes. He would point out the way the light hit a building, or the interesting composition of shadows on a sidewalk. He started to notice the things he used to miss, the small details that I had always cherished. We were teaching each other how to see. It wasn't a life without scars. There was still a lingering sadness for the hurt we had caused, a quiet acknowledgement of the lives we had upended to find our way to each other. We didn't ignore it or pretend it hadn't happened. It was part of our story, the difficult, painful first chapter. But we didn't let it define us. Our relationship was not born just from an ending, but from a long, slow, subterranean beginning that had been growing under the surface of our lives for years. The trip to Seattle wasn't the cause. It was just the earthquake that finally fractured the ground and let the truth come to light. We had to lose everything we thought we wanted to finally gain the one thing we had both desperately, secretly needed: a place to be bedrock for each other. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and he is asleep beside me, his head on my shoulder, I think back to that hotel room in Seattle. I remember the fear, the confusion, the wild, terrifying hope. I remember the feeling of his weight against me, a weight that felt less like a burden and more like an anchor, holding me steady in a world that was about to be torn apart. It's funny how a moment can be both a cataclysm and a salvation. It can be the end of everything and the beginning of everything, all at once. We are all, I think, just walking around with a hidden architecture inside of us, a blueprint for the life we are truly meant to inhabit. And we spend so much time and energy building something else, something sensible and expected, that we forget to listen to the groaning of our own foundations. We learn to ignore the signs that we are living in the wrong house. But if you are lucky, if you are incredibly, terrifyingly lucky, someone will come along and lean on you with just the right amount of pressure, and the walls you so carefully built will finally, blessedly, come tumbling down. And in the beautiful, honest silence of the wreckage, you can finally begin to build a home.